Welcome everyone to our panel it's called Let's Talk About Bias and Diversity in Data, Software, and Institutions. I'd be remiss if I didn't make sure that everyone understood this is heavily supported by and hosted really by the Machine Learning at Gottech Center, of which I'm very proud to be a member. It's a intersectional, interdisciplinary approach to how we do things at Georgia Tech in this incredibly large field. We're really honored today to have several folks in alphabetical order. We have Ms. Tiffany Deng. She's the leader of the Responsible AI Program Management Team at Google, focused on helping people build products that work for everyone. She's also worked at a privacy program manager at Facebook and was a consultant, and originally was, earlier perhaps in her career, not originally, was also in the military, which I think is important as we get into this because that's another really interesting large institution. Next, wait. Okay, now I'm going to prove that I've forgotten the alphabet. I'm going to just go with Rapha. Rapha, is it Gontijo, Rapha?
Gontijo.
Gontijo, excuse me, Lopes. He's a research associate at Google Brain, founder of Queer and AI, joined Google as a resident in the summer of 2018, and is a graduate of Georgia Tech. He's looking at how deep learning works or doesn't, which is an honest statement there, and how input distributions affect model robustness. In addition, because he's a slacker too, he's an organizer of Queer and AI and has academic workshops that look at the research conversation in the intersection of AI and LGBTQ plus people. And then we also are thrilled to have Dean Charles Isbell. He's the Dean of Computing and the John P. Imlay Jr. Chair at Georgia Tech's College of Computing. He's a professor in the School of Interactive Computing and Machine Learning Center at Georgia Tech. He's passionate about artificial intelligence and focuses on statistical machine learning to build autonomous agents that must live and interact with large numbers of other intelligence, some of whom might be human. An honest way, again, of putting that. And if you want to dig around on Dean Isbell, I'm going to point out he's also a not-so-secret aficionado of hip-hop. At some point, I'm hoping to find out what he thinks about hip-hop evolution, which is really, I think, a fantastic documentary. And if you're on Netflix, you might enjoy. All right. With that, let's talk. For folks who are streaming in, we're going to try and parse this out a little. At first, we want to get into there's two big things here. What are the problems with bias and diversity in data and software? And what are some of the institutional things that we might also be needing to address? They're interrelated, without a doubt. And so hopefully we'll explore a lot of that coming up. So as a simple matter, what do you all think is the reason that we need to think about bias and diversity when we think about AI or ML? In that sense, what is missing? What has to be taken into account? How do you find this manifesting itself? Just what's on your front of your mind about why you're interested and passionate about this area? Tiffany, you nodded, so I'm going to say, why don't you start, please?
Noted. I will not nod any longer, so I don't get.
Sorry, professor habits.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I would say that AI is ubiquitous and really within our society, right, and continue to be so moving forward. I often tell this anecdote about why diversity is important around my family. So my son had this really bad rash all over his body. We took him to the dermatologist to kind of figure out what was going on with him. And they told us they were unable to diagnose him because his skin didn't turn red, right? And so they were unsure of what the rash was, just looking at their chart, right? And so as a parent, this is super troubling. You can't diagnose my son because his skin is too dark, right? And it doesn't the rash and the symptoms don't manifest themselves in the same way as it would for someone with lighter skin, right? And so you think of my son as this data point, within, this algorithm, within this hospital, right? That'll be deployed to millions upon millions of people. And data on him is missing. And it's missing on him because he's different, because he looks different. right? And that's unacceptable, right? And so when you think about all of the things, all of our interactions, the things that we buy, the things that we like, the people we talk to, right? The medications, the medical care that we're able to have, all of those things are data points, and
So how did that
someday could
happen?
be. How did?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'm curious, how do you think that happened? Why was it that your son, as you point out, there's all these data points, you talked about medicine, et cetera. Why was there, do you believe, the gap?
The gap is because, I mean, I think you can go back to, the really systemic problem and the fissure, within, this country and the disparity in healthcare for people of color, and for, people, for white people, right? And there's a glaring difference there. And so when you think about medical books and the people who have historically, been writing these books, they have not looked, right, for other people to put in their books. So you think about the Fitzpatrick scale, and that's a scale we use for a lot of different things. And it's used for dermatology. It's been used in other use cases, right, in technology as well. But, there's missing pieces, right? People that look like me, people that look like my son.
Excellent. So then with that, I'm curious from either of the other panels. So how is it then, because I think in a previous interview, Tiffany, you pointed out the notion of reinforcing, right? That one of the dangers, and we might reinforce this, it may or may not have been malicious. I think your point of structural is a big deal here. Structural can have, there's a thing called structural violence in some of the social science literature, which I think is a big deal as well. But then I'm curious, so how might data scientists, AI or ML researchers start to address that? If you wish to keep going, go ahead. But I'm curious also if Charles or Rapha, you have some way that you're seeing some potentials to leverage to fix what Tiffany's identified.
Well, I mean, I think if you think of it, there was a key sentence in what Tiffany said in describing her son. It says because he is different, but he's not different. He's different from the people making the decisions. He's different from the people who are allocating the resources, different from the people who have decided what is an interesting scientific question, or in this case, medical question to ask. So to me, if you wanted to be very succinct about it, that's kind of the key observation, that there's a set of people who made a decision about what was interesting, and they focused on, for whatever reason, a particular group. There's lots of reasons why that might be, and it led to this outcome, right? So if the question is, how do you fix any of this, or how do you begin to address it? Seems to me the simplest thing is to think about who's making the decisions. Who are the people who are designing the systems? Who are the people who are asking the questions? And make certain that there are more people with a broader set of experiences and perspectives who are asking the questions and making the decisions.
So that's going forward. How do folks in your all's world deal with the issue of, let's suppose you were conscientious, but your data set, how do you start to realize that your historical data is flawed, for want of a better term? That seems to be a huge problem here, which is, so sticking with medicine, as I remember, if I'm not mistaken, one of the odd quirks is over time, people realized there's a gender bias too, right? Which was a lot of drugs, it turns out, work better on men than women sometimes, if I'm not mistaken. And that had to do with, if I remember correctly, the people who volunteered for drug studies. Now, that seems to me, as science folks, that you all have a moment of like, whoa, you should have been sensitive to that gap, right?
Right. Well,
I don't know if I'm making sense.
Well, someone in the chat is saying, I was pointing out that you may not be surprised that a lot of health research have subjects that are 95% white based on self-reported race. The gender issue is interesting because it works both ways. So if I recall correctly, our sort of medical knowledge around heart attacks is very geared towards males. And by the way, not just in terms of what we know in terms of medicine, but the way the sort of popular media thinks about what a heart attack looks like. And so that makes things worse for women who tend to have those things expressed differently. But by the way, it works the other way with things like breast cancer. Last numbers I saw, which is a long time ago, suggest that basically if you're a male and you have breast cancer, you're going to die because it doesn't even occur to you that that's something that that you can do. But so in the end, you come back to the same problem, right? You ask the question, how do you sort of fix these things if they're backwards? How do you going forward, we can maybe make the world better and have more people involved. But how do we deal with the problems that we've had going backwards? I think the first thing is to admit that that's true, and to take the tools that you're going to do to make things better going forward and try to apply it retroactively, and recognize that you don't have the data.
So how would you, as a group, how would you coach, right? Someone's getting into this field. They're given this cool data set, but as you all say, look, we know that there's going to be problems. How does one maybe, before you make huge decisions or build systems that you launch in the world, how does someone start to step back? Are there techniques that perhaps researchers should be using to say, whoa, let me just double check what the assumptions were? Because that might be one way to think about the data. Rapha, do you have an idea here, perhaps?
Yeah, I think one of the best things that anyone working on any problem can do is listen to people who criticize it. In particular, involving the people who would be affected, involving any stakeholders who would be affected by whatever you're creating. You came up with a data set for whatever it is. You came up with a data set for, let's stick with the medical theme, for detecting rashes in skin, let's say. Come up with a list of stakeholders. Who are the patients? Who are the people who are going to be impacted by this? Ask questions to them. Get them to participate in the process of your research. That's how you actually, because the recognition here is that you're not going to have all the answers. Neither is anyone in your team going to have all the answers, even if your team is very diverse. Although having a very diverse team helps, it's not going to be the end solution. You have to recognize that no one is going to have all of the answers, so you have to be able to listen and involve people who might have a different perspective on that.
So pushing on that, Rapha, is there a role for perhaps data visualization, especially before something is sort of launched into the wild, and even ongoing perhaps, that might sensitize a team to, wow, we didn't know that would be a blind spot? Are there techniques that maybe it's sort of, to your point, talking to stakeholders, but also just other familiar techniques that might say, wow, we thought this would work, but to your point, if we just stop and think, does this work on someone like in Tiffany's family? Are there ways to run those sorts of tests? Of course, we're not going to always get perfect, but to maybe improve oh my gosh, I had no idea this would come out that way. That's just not good. Just curious.
Yeah, I think that I think there are many, I personally don't work on visualization, so I don't know any specifics, but I do know that there's a lot of things that you could try. But even those are things that need to be, it's the problem there is that it kind of requires you to know what you're looking for, if that makes any sense, right? You have to know that because the model, whatever network you're training, if you're working on a machine learning problem, it's not going to tell you what it doesn't know. So if you're looking for the right things, you might be able to find those answers. So I think that the answer to that is like you have to develop that set of techniques by thinking of those questions, by thinking of who could be affected, and then you come up with a set of techniques that can be more generally like diagnostic, if that makes sense.
Okay. Tiffany, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just building, I think Rapha made some great points. And so building on what he was saying, I think that you have to make sure that you understand the historical and the societal context, right? Of what has happened and what's going on, right? And so again, to Rapha's point, once you've understood that, then there are tools, right? There can be tools at your disposal to help you understand and analyze the data. So for instance, Google has the what if tool, right? So you can like upload your data, right? And it can show you where there are disparities within your data. But again, you have to understand how, from a societal context and historical context, things may show up in that, right? You can use TFX, TFMA, so TensorFlow and TensorFlow model analysis, right? And you can do fairness indicators, right? And it will show you, how your model is performing for different distributions and for different groups and different sensitive characteristics. So there are, visualizations and there are tools to use. But, Rapha makes a great point about having to understand what you may be looking for and where the gaps may lie.
Okay. Charles, what do you think in terms of one thing that there's an an example that's come up in some of the early literature, early being 5, maybe 7 years ago now, not that long ago, about Boston and potholes. And one of the things that I think gets a little obscured there was, if I remember correctly, City of Boston was trying to detect potholes, and then they quickly noticed something odd, which was it really wasn't detecting out of, except for more wealthy neighborhoods. But they had been working with Boston University's scientists who quickly said, because they were using a map just to see results, to go, use your common sense. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you hope that scientists will start to also double check themselves on just a gut check of what I like to tell my students is, say that out loud. Say that out loud. Does that even sound right to you? Like, oh, from Tiffany's example, well, children with dark skin don't have rashes. Like, excuse me, did you really just say that? Like, that can't be right. And I'm curious then, do you have a sense of what are the things that allow scientists to just double check themselves and maybe not be a little too in love with their data set and say, well, what am I not thinking about?
Well, Rapha said earlier about being open to criticism. I think the truth is I'm going to say this, it's an education problem, right? That we have a way of doing things and we don't particularly have the infrastructure in place. So in fact, I would argue even the words that we're using here are problematic. So we talk about machine learning. I'm a machine learning guy. That's what it says on my website. So it must be true. But the truth is, even as machine learning people, we're actually a part of something larger. We're data scientists. And why would we talk about something like data science? Because there's an entire pipeline. Right? We use pipeline a lot in particular ways. Here I'm using it in the way things happen historically. We tend to think about the data we have in front of us. We tend to think about the problem we have in front of us. We don't ask ourselves, is this the right data? Is this the right question to ask? Is this the right problem to solve? So because we sort of act as, scientifically, we act as kind of Markov decision processes, right? We're here, the past doesn't matter, all that matters is what I have. It's very easy to fall into traps, right? What you have to do is you have to ask yourself, I got this data. Where did this data come from? Why was it put together this way? What is the historical? You have to go back from where you currently are, as opposed to pretending or assuming that everything you currently have is okay, and the problem is just to deal with whatever it is that I have. That is difficult. It is difficult for a couple of reasons. One, it's difficult because it's hard. It requires more time. It requires more effort. But it's also difficult because you're not trained to do that. We don't train ourselves to do it. We don't think about it. We don't give people Fs on their reports when they're in college because they didn't do it. We don't. The whole system is kind of set up to deal with what we have, not with how we got to where we are. And so until we sort of think about that as the process we have to go through, and the incentives are set up so that if you don't follow that process, nobody listens to you. We'll just continue to do it. It's just too easy to do.
So is this where counterfactuals might really be useful? Just continually run the sort of what ifs? Is that something that maybe anyone who wants to be in this field should always be a little more skeptical? Is that a relatively safe statement? Okay, so with that, Rapha, what are some of the challenges for that?
With being skeptical?
Yeah, I think we were talking before, and you had some interesting points about how it's really quite difficult sometimes as a researcher to get outside of shall we call it a train of thought or a stream of research. So what are the tensions that you've experienced there?
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest tensions is that as a culture in research, we have things that we value. And those things, like Charles was saying, they're handed out to us, and we are told that these things are, they are correct. These data sets are good. You should use them. These are the tasks we care about. And sometimes that might not be true, but it is really hard to question those things because, one, that requires work, like Charles said. But two, that not only does it require work, but it also is oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
I got you. I think what you're trying to get into is there's work because we have a train of thought, and we're trying to get the challenges of stepping outside of sort of, call it, maybe for want of a better term, the mainstream of research.
Yes, sorry, I got it back. Yeah. So one, it takes work, and two, it goes against the culture in some sense, right? If you are a researcher in any industry or in academia, you're still trying to publish papers. You're still trying to make a name for your career, and it's really hard for you to come out of that and say, well, actually, I think working on these problems is not good. We should not do it. Instead, we should work on these other problems that no one works on. And that makes it really hard for people to make that change, right? So in some level, it's also a cultural problem. It's also a thing that we need to do more of so that other people can feel freer to do more of as well. And I think part of, in terms of getting over that activation energy for starting to question things, I think the first thing that every scientist needs to do is try to get out of that mindset of being in an objective position and actually start to recognize that what they think is important to work on is actually a product of the academic culture that they are in. And that's how I think you start getting people who might not question the problems right now start to question the problems as well.
So Tiffany, how hard is that to do? I mean, obviously it's hard, but I think given that you've been around Silicon Valley as well as in another amazing institution, the military, right? There's a certain tension between an organization saying, look, you got to do X, versus we also claim to want thinking outside the box. I'm remembering the movie Lawrence of Arabia, where Lawrence has done something completely out of bounds, and the new general says, well, who told you to do that? No one. Well, then why'd you do it? Well, aren't we supposed to take initiative? Not really, was the response. It's too dangerous. But, he won, so he got away with it. I'm curious, how do you see, either from your experience on your team, the ability to kind of do some of the work that Rapha's talking about?
Yeah, I think it is just questioning, should we be doing this, right? I think that's a very, very fundamental question to AI. And then I think it's also just thinking more broadly and bringing people to the fold, right? So Charles made a great point about we're not trained to do this, right, as data scientists. And so one of the things that we have to think of is, how do we get social scientists involved, right? These issues cut, across many different domains, right? So you should bring social scientists into the fold. I was an intelligence officer in the military, and all of what we did, right? There's, a quantitative component, there's data, there's things you have to analyze, right? But there's a people component, right?
Yeah.
A very strong people component, and the ability to understand people and motivations and things like that. And I would argue, there are parallels too in this world, right? Needing to understand people, needing to understand history, needing to understand, why things are the way that they are in order to inform the decisions that you'll make moving forward, right? So bringing together all of these different disciplines is super important. You may not be trained to do it, but there are many, many people that are, and you should respect their work and bring them in for their opinion because it can only make yours much better.
Fantastic. So, I think some of the things we've been getting at is it's an interesting, to me, tension that intersects. And I think it's Kate Crawford who did a nice job putting this together about the fact that where we started was there's allocative harms, right? The lack of healthcare, criminal justice issues, other sort of things that are structural, systemal, and systemic. And there's been a lot of work on that. There's also representational harms because we might be reinforcing subordination. And I think what you all have pointed out is, even though it might be nice to structurally think about it, they go like this because they feed into each other. So with that, let's talk a little bit more about the institutional things that might happen here, right? Because it could be that it's private industry or academic centers or the government to kind of get into this. But at the same time, I think we should start to ask, okay, why is it so important to improve hiring and diversity within large tech companies, if not in general? But since we're sort of in the tech space, and focusing on the groups that have the power with AI and ML, it seems obvious, but what are we lacking if we don't do that? You want to continue, Tiffany? Or you're all nodding, so now I'm no longer, Tiffany, you promised me you wouldn't nod, you did, but then so did Rapha and Charles. So you know what?
I think Charles came off of mute first. So
I was going to say, you know what? We'll make the dean put on his dean hat.
All right. Well, so there's two things built into the question you're asking about sort of institutions, and you're asking why it's important. It's important. The answer is just very simple. It's important because it's the right thing to do, period. It's a moral question. So as far as I'm concerned, that's as far as it has to go. But if you need more than the moral question or the moral answer, then it's because you get something better out of it at the end. Now, I will say, and I do think it's important, that even though you get something better out of it at the end, and this is well documented and everybody understands it, it doesn't make it easier. I mean, we know that diverse teams do better, but we also know that they're less happy. And it's because there is conflict. It's because there is tension. It's because people are making you do more than you want to do. And we shouldn't pretend otherwise. And if, as institutions and people who are leading institutions, whatever those institutions are, if we don't recognize that, then we end up with problems because people get upset, they push back, it's not worth your time to deal with it. And so you don't actually make the progress you want to make. So we have to be realistic about the kind of transition that you're going through and what you have to set up, which brings me to the second point, and then I'll yield the floor, which is it's all incentives. It's all incentives. It's all the incentives that are visible, the incentives that are invisible, that sort of drive us down one path or another. Those incentives are sometimes individual. They're, just cultural, but a lot of them are structural. And to me, what I found, as I've tried to think about these problems over the years, is that the best thing you can do is surface as many assumptions as you can and try to make clear, preferably backed with data, about why you are where you are, so that you can actually address the real problem. If you do that, then you can create incentives. You can try to set up the world in the right way. And if you don't do that, then you're just blindly going around doing things.
Okay, so Rapha, you've done a lot of work with workshops, and I'm curious, that's outside of having diversity necessarily within your company or others, but what are the advantages perhaps of nonetheless having that kind of network, and how might that connect within an institution in your experience? Yeah,
so for people who don't know, the Queer and AI organization that I started with a bunch of other people back in, including some other Georgia Tech graduates, we started back in 2018 after going to NeurIPS and looking around and not being able to at least recognize queer people, partly because they weren't visible, maybe because they were not out. And as we've learned from our demographic survey, a lot of them are not out, perhaps because they don't feel comfortable being out in an academic environment, right? And so we started that to create the community and to find each other, essentially. And part of the reason why we did that is because we realized that we were not happy looking around and not seeing ourselves around us as well, right? We were unhappy looking at all of this interesting research and realizing that, well, do we belong here? Like, well, what's going on? So I think the community aspect was one of the main drivers, but as you said, it is kind of an outside of institution type thing. It's not a Google project. It's an external thing, right? And the good thing about that is that it allows us not only to connect us to a larger audience of queer people and to make a bigger impact, because it allows us to help diversify the field as a whole and perhaps improve the problem picking that we talked about. But it also allows us to identify issues that are common between institutions, right? It allows us to look at and say, oh, this company is not doing as well as this one, or this company is doing, or these two companies have this similar issue, and this is how we came up with a solution in this one. Maybe it's worth transferring that over there. So it has this like support network that's extended, and I'm talking about companies, but a lot of our membership is PhD students in academia, right? So where, as we know, it's like one of the places where mental health deteriorates the fastest. Yeah. So having that community is vital for a lot of people.
That's fantastic. And so, Tiffany, I'm curious, what's your perspective on how having a network of people that, I'm not going to say that they're all like-minded. I'm actually remembering now Donna Haraway's work on the Cyborg Manifesto, and it's an amazing piece to me because one of the things she said is, in a networked world, we get to cross so many lines. There's not an essence to identity, and yet there is something about having affinities and talking to people that, as Rapha's describing, I'm curious for you, how does having some, I guess, allies or just people where you're feeling you can get into what you want to get into aid you personally, and how does it also aid an organization in terms of addressing ongoing issues?
I mean, it's vital. Excuse me. And also want to acknowledge that there's a 6-year-old cackling in the background, so apologies. I will address that in just a minute. But It is vital because having those people that can pull you up, right, to that table and pull out that chair for you, that can ensure that you're involved, right, in conversations that you may have been left out of, right, which is a really real issue when you're the one or the only or one of the few, that making sure that you have other allies and act as that conduit and that connector. It's really important because they can singularly act as a force multiplier for you,
Yeah.
and really be able to increase the velocity in with which you can do your work and you can be impactful and that you can be seen. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really act in that capacity for others at all times. And I certainly try to do that. I think it's also important because they help you understand your blind spots as well. I know many may be familiar with this lawsuit that 30, Dalit women in Silicon Valley have brought against tech companies over caste discrimination, right? And I work in fairness because those types of things bother me, right? They hurt me, right? And to see that, right, within our industry, like within our, all of these different forums, right, is hurtful, right? So having also, people that bring a different perspective can help open up your aperture and help you, really be more in tune with some of those blind spots and areas that you may not be helping others in, to really keep your eyes open and ensure that there's fairness and equity across the organization for all those that are working.
It reminds me a little of right when I got to tech, I got a call when Tim Cook said, yes, I'm in fact gay. And the interviewer asked me what I thought was a funny question, but made sense, I guess. It was, do you think people will stop buying Apple products? It's like, well, from what I know about Apple demographics, not at all. And then I said, but I think the advantage that you're not catching here is it's going to be a signal for talent. And by that I meant, that if you go to Apple, you can be who you are, because what they want to do is work you to death, and you're excited by it, you're paid well, you have access to things, but you're not going to be, hopefully less of the environment is, oh, what about this other stuff going on with you? It's like, yeah, that's who I am. But what I want is to do good work and have people who let me do work and mentor me, which I hope then can help. Charles, if you could talk about how this affects both bringing in students at all levels and sort of the question of how we build out more people who are diverse in the field. Because it is, sure, as you said, it's morally right, but the structural issues here, I think, are deep.
Yeah. So, by the way, the structural issues are deep, and I'm happy to talk about them. In particular, I'd love to talk about how they work at the level of hiring faculty. But I want to make a point here that we did something subtle in this conversation. We switched from when we talked about community and critical mass and bringing people in and the things you can do. We actually switched from at least 3 different roles there. But for the purpose of this discussion, I want to identify 2. One is mentors, support networks, people you can talk to and you listen to. But the others are sponsors, right? People who actually can impact your life and make a difference. And those are not always the same. And in fact, they're definitionally quite different. And I think this matters a lot because I think it's very easy to think about mentorship, but really what we care about to affect the sort of change we're talking about here is sponsorship. I saw a statistic a few years ago that something to the effect of most women and underrepresented minorities have about twice as many mentors as their white male counterparts, but they only have half as many sponsors. And without sponsors, you can't go anywhere. And so we focus on, building the community that's necessary, but we have to recognize that it has to turn into actual action. And without it, you feel better, but you don't actually get anywhere you want to get. And I think, to use the word that you used, signal, this matters a lot in creating the sort of signals that you make and what you allow other people to do, and having people in positions of sponsorship, positions of leadership, power, influence, however you want to describe it, are important. And what you're going to get is by having people there, you will get the follow-on of bringing more people in, because it's not that the pipeline isn't full. It's not that they aren't there and they aren't interested and we need to get them. That's not true at all. Work that was done at Georgia Tech actually showed that, the group that is most interested in going into computer science, a demographic group most interested in going into computer science in high school, are Black males. Something happens between high school and, the first or second year of college, and those numbers all go away. It's not a pipeline problem. The number of students who are graduating with computing degrees who might want to go on and get PhDs that number is large. It's not that there aren't enough people out there. It's just that there are things that we're doing later on where we're not bringing those people in. It's not that there's a lack of interest. It's not that there's a lack of numbers, and that requires that the people who are making decisions, which include a large number of people on this call, have to be intentional about it. And I got a story I could tell you about the way things work with faculty if you're interested. But I mean, I think that at the end of the day, we as people in these positions are making these decisions and not making the decisions and not accepting our own individual responsibility for affecting change.
Fantastic. So, wow, time's flying. We could probably do this for hours, I think, and dig deeper. But we also want to be fair. There's people who've got some chat questions. So I want to make sure we get to them, and if we can, we'll circle back. But at the risk of being too wonky for this crowd, I think what you're describing, Charles, is this notion of social capital, but it's simpler. There's a game, and we have to make sure we're all involved, I think, in making sure people know what that is and helping them through. And so with that, so folks, if you can use the Q&A, it's a little bit easier to double check what's going on, but I'll also try and scroll some chat to double check what we might have had here. So one particular question in the chat that came up a little while ago was, I think, a quick one. So someone is asking, how common is it for social scientists to work on ML research teams to bring in the social and historical perspectives? I recall Intel used to have a really big group on this, and I don't think it's actually still functional. So it's a great question. I'm curious, how much are, at least if you can say within Google or others, teams allowed to bring in this kind of perspective and expertise?
Sure, yeah. At Google, we have what's called our ethical AI team. And it's a group that includes social scientists. I think that people are understanding the need for that even more. And I'm sure, there may be other pockets of people like with social scientists in other pockets of the company. But I know that our ethical AI team in Google Brain does have social scientists on that group.
And are they relatively equal? This is my own bias. From when I was inside Google, it was sort of, you're not a CS person, we're not so sure.
Oh, equal, and yeah, sure. I mean, so that group is very, on the forefront of thinking, very much, with the intersection between the socio-technical world, right? And so their work is integral to a lot of the work and the research agenda that team is focused on.
Okay, so in the Q&A, I'm going to try and go in reverse order to be fair to people who got in early, and there's some voting here. Someone has asked, the steps we've discussed so far require researchers on their own accord to think carefully about broader implications of the work. How can we change the incentives in academia industry so we're not just depending on the conscientiousness of individual researchers? Ooh, strong question. Careful, Tiffany, you were nodding again. But Rapha did too, so I'm going to say, Rapha, go for it.
Yeah, so I think about this a lot because I think a lot about what is political common sense, meaning, to give a very quick example, right now there's a lot of things that are in play in politics, but there's a lot of things that are no longer in play. There are now common sense. You can no longer talk about, women have the right to vote. That's not up for debate anymore, right? Mm-hmm. And in the same way, I think this is how you make change. You change the political common sense. You make it such that not thinking about these questions deeply is unthinkable. And there's many strategies for doing that. And there's some of the strategies are writing critical theory papers. Some of them are writing New York Times articles exposing ML problems, right? There's many strategies of raising awareness so that people know that this is an important thing to do. I can try to think of many other strategies, but there's not one solution to it. I think the key thing, though, is that you do need to make it be top of mind for everyone working on any technological problem.
Is it ironic, Rapha, though, right? Google continues to be as much of Silicon Valley in the crosshairs right now of government, and yet because they're all so big, for want of a better term, it does seem odd, though, right? I mean, there's no way these companies are not reaching people throughout the entire continent of Africa and the wide range, although European range of Europe, and all over, Asia, such as it is, which is frankly a term that I find useless because, there's 1.2 billion of people from my background and then a billion or more people in China. And then you add in everyone else. It's like, what does Asia mean? But with those markets alone, how is it that companies have these ridiculous blind spots where we started with Tiffany? It seems fascinating. Is that maybe a little spot where companies say, look, we got to make these products work in every market? Is that almost too easy, or am I just the unfrozen caveman lawyer who's like, no, that's just, you're wrong, it's not going to work?
I think it gets to the point that economic incentives are not the final solution. It's missing something. I think it's missing. I guess what I was trying to get at is that there are social incentives as well, right? There's cultural incentives and those are the things that if you change those, that's going to be a permanent solution, or at least a more permanent solution than a market solution.
Excellent.
So if I can just jump in for a second, there's
Please.
Another way of this, I think, which to answer the question directly is it comes from above. And my colleagues don't like to hear these things, but it's true. Maybe the impetus for change comes from below. Maybe people, demand change. But at the end of the day, the president or the CEO decides that something is true. The president and CEO has the budget. It works its way down. If people who are the decision makers are not behind whatever it is you're trying to do and do not force the issue through economic incentives, social incentives, or otherwise, it just doesn't happen. By the way, even when it comes to things like politics, political scientists will tell you, it turns out that the base, the people who are part of your party or whatever, respond to what their leaders do. If their leaders say it's okay to say these crazy things, then they believe these crazy things. If the people in charge say this is not okay, then people change. It actually is driven a lot. I mean, it's just the way people are. It's just we're a hierarchical group. This is what we do, and things have to come from above, including the setting of incentives. You can affect those people, but in the end, they have to push it down, or it just doesn't happen.
Well, Charles, I think this actually is a great way to then segue two different iterations of questions that I think come out to one, things that you had mentioned, which were as a more general matter. There was a question about the moral ethical component, and specifically was how can that perhaps be emphasized, or do you believe it has to be emphasized within GT curriculum or student life? And that connects, I have a feeling, to your story about faculty.
Okay.
So would you mind seeing if you could tackle those, please?
I'll do it quickly. So the answer to the first question is yes. It needs to work its way into the curriculum. I tend to think of it in terms of responsibility as opposed to morality or ethics, because I think that captures something a little bit broader, or at least what I'm interested in. To me, you have to accept responsibility from the very first for loop you write. We talk about tool sets and skill sets. To me, this is a mindset, right? It just has to be a fundamental way of thinking. So much of what we're talking about is really, do you think about it automatically without even realizing you're thinking about it? You have to set those things in from the beginning, because once the habits are in, the habits are in. So yes, and we're doing a bunch of things to change the way the curriculum works at the undergraduate and graduate level to address this. For the faculty thing, I think this ties in nicely with this notion of incentives. I'm just going to throw a bunch of numbers at you very quickly. These numbers are true as of 2017. So if you look at computer science and you look at faculty, here's the thing that you discover. Roughly 60% of all faculty in the top 4 earn their PhDs from the top 4. The reason it's a top 4 as opposed to a top 5 is because MIT, CMU, Berkeley, and Stanford are all tied for number 1, right? So 60% of those faculty earn their PhDs from those 4 places. 65% of faculty in the top 10, which includes Georgia Tech, earn their PhDs from the top 10. And in fact, if you look at the top 55 ranked departments, over 50% of all the faculty earn their PhDs from the top 10 places. 10 places impact over half of the faculty, basically all of the R1 units across the country. In fact, if you look very carefully, it's worse than that. Turns out if you do a study, I won't go into the details here, but if you look at the way graduate admissions work, it works like this. You admit everyone from places that are ranked higher than you, most people from places ranked around you, and no one from places ranked below you, with the exception of small liberal arts colleges like Harvey Mudd, which means the decision of whether you become a professor at Georgia Tech was decided when you were 17 years old. What is driving all of this? What's driving all of this is a fundamental reality. It's kind of a game theory problem, which is that I'm hiring one person. I'm going to be stuck with that person for somewhere between 7 and 35 years. There's 100 people applying. This is the Google search problem, right? The only thing that matters is that I don't have any false positives. Who cares if I say no to someone who could make it, so long as I only say yes to someone who does? And what are you going to do? The people who are in the audience who are old enough know that nobody ever got fired buying a computer from IBM, right? And so nobody ever gets in trouble for bringing someone in who got a PhD from MIT. That's just the way it is. And so the structure is set up in such a way that we do this. So short version, this is my short version, believe it or not. The short version of this is that if you look very carefully, it turns out if you look at underrepresented minorities, particularly black faculty, because I happen to have the numbers for those, prior to January of 2018, I told you 65% of faculty in the top 10 earn their PhDs from the top 10. What percentage of black faculty in the top 10 earn their PhDs from the top 10? 100%. Which means that whenever you have any concerns, whether it's explicit or implicit, you raise the bar. You really are worried about the false positives. So it is structurally built into the system because of this sense of scarcity, all the way from the very beginning, that you're going to make it more and more difficult to bring in people with a wider set of voices. That's fixable once you see the data and you point this out to people and you ask them to think about it. It can be fixed. And we've done a lot of things to fix this in the last 3 or 4 years, not just at Tech, but across multiple universities. But until it was brought to bear as a question, and until we surfaced our assumptions about how we were admitting faculty, we were unable to make any change.
That's awesome. It seems like you're not saying it's an explore exploit issue. You're actually saying, no, your equilibrium, in fact, exploration itself, looking outside your normal, is not as big a problem as you think. You're missing stuff. And I'm curious for either Rapha or Tiffany, you don't have to put Google online. It's not fair to you to ask that. But let's pretend you have your own tech company. It's doing well. How would you try and put what Charles has said into action in a private company to get people to realize, stop just going to the same places, which, arguably, Rapha, puts you at a different disadvantage, right? You came out of Georgia Tech. That's an edge. But I'm wondering, that's a big statement that we just heard. What do you think?
It's 100% correct, right? It's a glaring problem, and then there's just no way to say that it's incorrect. It's correct. I would say that for me, right, you do have to look at transferable skills in that from a military perspective as well. Too, I'll just take that. There are a lot of people that come out of the military that do not think that they are qualified to do anything, right? And there are a lot of people that are hiring, right, that think that people that came from the military aren't qualified to do anything. But they are. They have degrees, right? Not from MIT and not from Harvard and not from Stanford, but they have them, right? They're in the right domains, right? They have a ton of lived experience, coalition building, right? They've run cities, right, in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? They have all of these skills that, when brought together, and when somebody is willing to take a chance, and I would say it's not even a chance, right? Like they're proven leaders, right? Yeah. They can perform, they will perform. You can extrapolate that to almost any context and almost any, group of people, right? Who don't get those opportunities simply because of, the university that comes, first in their resume or behind their name in their resume. And so I think it's incumbent upon leadership, hiring managers, staffing agencies, right, to look beyond, because they're really the first line of screening, right, to really look beyond some of the things that, they traditionally may, and to understand some of these other skills that people bring to the table. Because again, you don't have to make this large leap. Like, no one's asking you to bring in an art major, right, for like a data science position. No one's asking you to do that, right? They have very clear degrees and very clear credentials, but it's that first kind of line of screening that kind of takes people out of contention. And I think that we need to hone in on that so that people really understand the value that people still bring.
Awesome. Hey, Rapha, so someone has a question I want to riff on to push a little what Tiffany's saying. They said, do any of you feel that companies will or should start to screen for their ability to consider ethical implications of algorithms like they do for technical skills? And I'm wondering, given your background, that you might be able to actually go a little harder at this and say, what would be a good question if you're hiring someone for a tech team to get at some of the ideas that Tiffany's talking about and that you care about in terms of saying, okay, I also want to see what your other dimensions are.
Yeah,
it's not
that's
easy.
a good.
Take a moment.
That is a hard
trick.
question.
Stroke the beard, it helps.
I don't know if I'm gonna have a perfect answer
Of course
here,
not.
but
Don't worry about
I
it.
do. So I think one good indicator is, I mean, let's assume that this is an interview environment, right? Like I think the thing you're looking for in a candidate is the ability to ask the questions, right? So maybe the question is just like, here's a scenario, here's something that we're considering exploring, here's like a system. What questions would you ask about this? And if they ask technical questions, great. Like that's an important aspect of the interview, right? But you could also push them and say, okay, what other kinds of non-technical questions would you ask about this? And then see if they explore, one, should this be built in the first place? Especially if you give them an example that maybe shouldn't be built. And maybe has some other ethical implications. Or maybe their answer is simply like, actually, I'm not fully sure, but I would want to ask this and this person because I feel like these people would be impacted by this. These people would have a better perspective than I do. So before starting to build this, before deploying it, I would want to ask more questions about it. And I think that's like the ability to recognize that you don't have all the answers, I think is the key thing that you're going to be looking for.
That's great. Very nice. Okay, we're down to 2 minutes, and I don't see any new questions. My apologies if I missed anything. So in the last seconds, all right, any quick resources that you all might point people to? Because this is a huge topic, and I'm hoping people want to stay engaged. And if that's not a fair question, like it's okay. You look people up, folks. But anything in particular, like, you got to read this one where you get people started, maybe.
One paper that just come out from William Isaac from DeepMind is Decolonizing AI. I think that's a really great paper, and I would encourage people to take a look there. Works by Ruha Benjamin, Tanit Gebru. Take a look at all of those. They're just really strong, wonderful people with amazing bodies of work, and I would definitely take a look.
Awesome.
I agree with that. I would also add A.M. Howard's new book, which just came out, Sex, Race, and Robots.
I want to echo all of those. I think they're great works. I also want to say there's, if you go to radicalai.net/work, that this is a page that I co-wrote with a bunch of other people that has a ton of really nice resources on everything from how technology shifts power to how to adopt a critical technical practice when doing your own work. There's a huge list of works if you want to do a deep dive into this topic.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot to bring that up. I noticed that when I was doing my homework for this. So we are almost out of time. I'm going to throw out something I mentioned. Donna Haraway, Cyborg Manifesto, written in the 80s, mind-blowingly prescient. Really gets into hard questions and talks about what it is to be in a networked world. So that's an old one. I will warn people, it's deeply critical theory, so some of it will hurt your head, but it's good. And with that, thank you, all of you. Please reach out again. We hope everyone stays in touch. Thank you to all of our attendees. And again, to ML at Gotek for hosting. It be one. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. Be well, everyone. Be safe, especially during COVID. Please be careful when you travel. And again, this is an ongoing thing that I'm excited because you all gave me a real sense that the work is being done and it's possible, which is fantastic. So thank you again.